Yeah. So God has left the building. The narrative of technocratic rationality is unraveling a bit, and you're kind of naming some of these habits and practices of vulnerability, of rootedness, of listening to the community. And so I thought maybe that would be a good space to move into, because you've also written a lot about practices for refounding the church, practices for joining God and remaking the church in the neighborhood. And so maybe we could take a second and talk about what some of those practices are in this vulnerable space. Where should the church?
Yeah. There's a distinction that needs to be made here. The practices are not a mystery or an enigma. These practices have been around for thousands of years. And it's not difficult to name these practices, which I'll do in a sec. So I'm not making any claim to having some unique picture into these practices. Mm-hmm. I would say that if you want to know what the practices are in this time, read Benedict. And of course, there's a lot of stuff right now being written about Benedict and what he was saying. But here's the point. Let me use Benedict as the illustration. Practices are not the point. It's the narrative lens through which one reads those practices. And so I've been saying in the writing, but with others, not just me, is that the location of Christian life is in what we call the parish. We would call it over here the local, the neighborhood, the place where we live. It's a call to go and dwell and be present. That's both a practice and a posture. And Benedict described it as the vow of stability. And the vow of stability means I commit myself to being where I am and recognizing the grass is green on the other side of the hill, but it always will be, but this is where I am. And what Benedict is getting at is I cannot know or be with the other or God or my friends unless I am living in stability. Now, that is a radical practice because everything we've done from the beginning of the 20th century forward has been to eviscerate and remove stability. And it's called the automobile and the highway and all of these things, the highway systems that we have and the automobiles that we have are not just tools, they are profound metaphors of our imagination. And what they tell us is that I, as an individual, am free anytime I want to pick up and go anywhere I want. And I will not be controlled or managed by anyone or any place at any time. Now, this is going to sound weird and overstated to a lot of people, but the reason it's weird and overstated is because we've now lived in it for 100 more years and we just go, well, that's what life is, right? So the first thing, practice, is the practice of stability, dwelling in your neighborhood. Now, what I've given you is a lens through which to read the why of that. If I don't understand the why, I'll practice my stability. Now, I may be overstating, you can tell me. Here's how I practice my stability. If I don't read it through that lens, I get in my car with my Bible and I drive 4 miles to other members of my church who look like me, sound like me, and wag their backsides like me. And we have this wonderful Bible study in which we all reinforce each other. And we call that stability. And it's not. Stability is being in the neighborhood with the people who are not always like me and don't go to the same church building as I do. And so stability, I would argue, as a practice, means deliberately choosing to park the car and be present. So that's one example of a practice. A second example of a practice Benedict described is prayer, which, that sounds like kind of like, baseball and ice cream, that what Christians do, pray. But again, the lens through which most, particularly Euro tribals, so I'm not talking about others, understand prayer is the lens of private individualism and the inner life of the soul. And so when they pray, when they do, they tend to, from the, this old Bible verse, go into their closet by themselves and do this kind of inner personal pietistic work about themselves. Because prayer, very particularly in evangelicalism, gets linked to inner piety. So that prayer has nothing to do with the people and the community and the neighborhood in which I live. And that's not what Benedict was up to. Benedict was how, with eyes open, we are seeing and being with and present with the people in the place where we're stable, and we're bringing those people in prayer. That's a very different way of ordering that practice. Or another practice coming out of Benedict is, you remember, for Benedict, it is pray constantly, and it's the table of hospitality, right? And so I would say one of the most profound practices that we need is the practice of, and there's two sides to this. One, inviting the neighbor to our table so that we are eating together. But secondly, being present at the neighbor's table so that the roles get reversed and we become guests at their table. This is Luke 10, 1 through 12. So I've just given you three simple practices: stability, prayer, and hospitality. Just doing those things would radically change our understanding of being God's people. And a fourth practice, which runs through all of these, that you would know, is what we call dwelling in the Word, which is the return of Lectio Divina, the sacred listening to Scripture. And because what's happened in Euro-tribal churches is that we have basically colonized people to believe that it's this guy with the degree, men and women now, who stand up behind a pulpit. And remember, the pulpit is a symbol for I've got authority and I'm telling you the truth, and you listen. And who quote teaches. But what we've taken away is the capacity of the community itself to listen and to discern amongst one another what the Spirit is asking and saying. So if you put those four practices together, stability, I'm in my neighborhood and in my community. I don't get in my car and drive to the Bible study at Starbucks. Prayer, I'm walking about my community, my neighborhood, and I'm looking and I'm seeing and I am praying constantly for the men and the women and the people that I meet in my barbershop and across, you get my point. Hospitality, I am present to the extent that I am being invited to the table of people in the community. And at that table, I'm being invited to listen and to hear. And in the midst of that, the dwelling. Because then you see, when we come together as God's people in a neighborhood and we begin to dwell in a text, we begin to ask and listen with one another in the sense of, so what are we hearing God saying to us through this text in the neighborhood around the table? So there's just four simple practices that I would propose would revolutionize being God's people today in North America.